Hello guys, I welcome you all to the first session of our short course on risk assessment. This session is titled Introduction to Risk Assessment. That's because in this session I'm just going to be talking about an overview of what risk assessment is all about. And then in subsequent sections or sessions, we're going to talk about the various other aspects of risk assessment. Basically, I like to refer to these three books, which I find them very, very useful. There are other books as well, which I have seen available in the library, and I've reviewed some of them, and I think they're very, very good books as well. But I like to use these three books, and I mostly relied on these books in developing my course. The first one is Risk Assessment, a practical guide to assessing operational risks, which is quite comprehensive. All right, the other one, which is Risk Assessment, Risk Management Tools for Safety Professionals by Bruce Lyon and Georgi Popov. And these guys have done a lot of work in risk assessments in terms of teaching courses. And these books as well come with Excel tools, right? Tools that you could use in Excel to carry out risk assessment to simplify the process. So I find them to be really excellent books. There's another book also called Cross-Country Pipeline, Risk Assessments and Mitigation Strategies. So this is also very, very useful because it's aside discussing the main topics in risk assessments in the beginning of the book. He also talked about its application to pipelines, cross-country pipelines. And he provided an Excel tool as well, which can also be reviewed, and it's very good to practice. There are some other resources as well, which I find really, really useful. You could go to this website, risk-engineering.org/course, or you can see other things he presented on the website. It's a very, very useful website as well, talking about various topics of various issues of risk assessments. Very, very good. As an introduction, people usually experts usually refer to the Titanic incident or accident as the history or the origin of the field of risk assessment. In April 14th of 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg on its first voyage and its maiden voyage, and this was 2 hours 40 minutes later she sank, and the ship sank. So how is this relevant to risk assessment? The first thing is that there were warnings to the captain of a potential ice flow, but the captain was instructed, despite warnings of potential ice flow, the captain was instructed to increase speed. All right, despite the fact that there was an iceberg ahead of the ship, the captain increased the speed without taking necessary precautions and slowing down. Also, a few lifeboats were available on board for 2,200 passengers, and they had 1,000 less lifeboats on board. Also, it means that they didn't take necessary precautions and they did not make adequate provisions in case there was an accident, and that was because they believed that the Titanic was unsinkable. All right, and also the lookout, that's the guy that was supposed to look ahead of the ship to see if there was any potential danger or hazard ahead, he was not provided with the binoculars. All right, again, ignoring risks, not properly assessing the risk or making necessary provisions or taking adequate precautions. So once this Titanic happened, it was a very celebrated event. It led to an investigation, and it turned around the shipbuilding industry and created the risk analysis industry as well. So people paid more attention, more focus to analyzing risks, assessing risks, and taking adequate precautions. So let's look at these 4 quadrants of risks, okay? So it means, for example, what is risk assessment made of? So we could say that risks could be strategic risks, all right? Or it could be financial risks. These two make up what you call speculative risks. While the other could be hazard risks, okay? Or operational risks. And these two make up what you call pure risks. Now, as for strategic or what you call speculative risks, they could be positive. There are risks that could have positive outcomes or they could have negative outcomes. I'll give you an example. Let's say you invested in a business. All right, this is related to financial investments, okay, market risk and stuff like that. So let's say you invested in a business and it turned out to be profitable, then that's a positive outcome. And if it turned out to be a loss, then that's a negative outcome. The case is different when you talk about pure risks. Pure risks are risks in the industries in terms of operational risks, construction risks, or other risks in the mechanical industry, automobile industry, or hazard risks that has to do with what? Has to do with fatalities, people in terms of injury and fatalities. It has to do with also facilities and property, okay, in terms of loss of facility, okay, and property. And it also has to do with the environment. All right, so this is what you call hazard risks. Okay, now our focus is basically on hazard risk in this course. However, it's good to know that there are different types of risks, okay, and risk could be in any of these four quadrants. Now, when we talk about risk, we have to talk about hazard, and that's why some people sometimes they use these two words interchangeably. That is risks and hazard. Some people use them to mean the same thing. However, they are different. They mean different things. Okay, and that's why some people say hazard assessment, some say risk assessment. Actually, there's a difference between these two, which we're going to discuss later on. Now, it says here that a hazard is the potential of a substance, activity, or process to cause harm. Now, the keyword here is potential. All right, so whatever has the potential to cause harm is called hazards. Okay, and they could be in many forms: chemicals, electricity, use of ladders, or you could say chemical hazards, physical hazards, biological hazards, until environmental hazards and things like that. As for a risk, it is the likelihood of a substance, activity, or process to cause harm. So you can see why one is the potential, the other one is the likelihood. Okay, so risk talks about the likelihood, talks about the probability of an accident or an incident, or probability of any of the substances to cause harm. So this is what you call a risk. We've seen this in this photo here, or in this illustration. We could have a more deeper understanding. Now here we have this guy standing just around the ocean, okay, or let's say at the seashore. Okay, so standing there at the banks of the ocean, and there's a shark in the ocean. Okay, this is the potential harm. The shark in the ocean is a potential harm to this guy. If the guy moves into the water, then there's actually a likelihood, right? There's a connection now. There's a likelihood that that harm may be caused, okay, or that harm may happen, and that is what you call the risk. So basically, this is the difference between the two of them. Well, the hazard is the presence, the existence of that energy that could lead to an accident, okay, or that could cause harm, or any potential unwanted event. While risk is the possibility and the likelihood that will actually happen, okay, and this likelihood could vary, okay, it could be very high or it could be very low, and that is basically the essence of risk assessment. So also here we could see in this table some examples to make it clear the difference between hazard and risk. Okay, so let's see. For example, here it says no safety helmet. All right, so this guy is not using a safety helmet. That's a potential hazard. Let's say he's in an industrial site or a construction site. But the likelihood that he's going to have head injuries, that harm will actually be caused, is called the risk. Okay, this likelihood could be low and it could be high. That depends on how many, what's the frequency of falling objects. Okay, are there falling objects on the site, and how frequently are these objects falling from heights? Right, so this could lead to head injuries. It could be other things. It could bump his head into overhead obstructions and things like that. Now, also, someone not using goggles, okay, you could have the risk of foreign matters falling into his eyes. Okay, so you could have the likelihood of foreign matters in his eyes, and also this could be low or high depending on the situation. Also, you could see other examples: no gloves and the likelihood of hand injuries, no ear defenders, like that is the ear muffs, or you could have canal caps or earplugs and stuff like that. So no ear defenders, this could lead to damage to hearing. You could have improper footwear, could lead to injuries to the feet. You have no respiratory mask, damage to lungs, etc. You will have 240 volts electrical supply, could lead to electrocution, poor electrical connections, could lead to electrocution, and side debris laying around could lead to tripping hazards. Okay, it could trip and fall. So basically, all these are called the likelihood of all this happening. It's called the risk. Okay. So what's a risk assessment? Based on this definition or this background of the difference between a hazard and a risk, what do we call risk assessment? Now, risk assessment is usually an essential part of planning stage of health and safety management system. All right, risk assessment has many other benefits. I believe we're going to discuss this later. But usually in health and safety management system in industries, usually risk assessment forms one of the most crucial and most important aspects of this. Risk assessment methods are used to decide on priorities, okay, to rank or rate the various hazards in the site based on the level of priority on and determining how to deal with them. So this will help to set objectives for eliminating hazards and reducing the risks. Now, you could divide risk assessment into two general forms. One of them is called the quantitative risk assessment, and the other is called qualitative risk assessment. And some other people have what you call the hybrid, right, which, semi-quantitative, or it's a hybrid of both quantitative and qualitative risk assessment methods. So a quantitative assessment attempts to measure the risk by relating the probability of the risk occurring to the possible severity of the outcome and then giving the risk a numerical value. So basically, quantitative, as from the word quantitative and quantifying the risk, it means that you have numbers, okay? You try to quantify the risk in terms of its likelihood, in terms of its severity, or you could use other words. Some people use consequence rather than severity. They would say consequence or could say impact, okay? Yeah, it could be consequence or impact. While the probability could also be referred to as likelihood or frequency. So these words could be used to describe it. So basically you have numerical values to quantify this risk, and then you determine the risk score. So basically also you will have what you call qualitative assessment. Qualitative assessment does not involve using numerical information. It basically involves using descriptive values, where you basically determine the severity and the likelihood of a risk with terms like high, medium, and low. So these are two forms of broad classifications of risk assessment. Now here in these slides, or in the next few slides, is just an example to see the kind of things that happen in industry. Though some of them may be exaggerated, but usually these are some things that people assume that people assume that they've been doing this for a very long time, and it usually leads not to it's not usually not going to cause any problem, or they might think that this is something they're going to do in just few minutes or seconds, and that should not be a problem. However, we see this thing happening recurringly. They happen again and again, and they lead to accidents in the workplace, and people fail to learn, even though they might say, oh, this is just common sense. But well, common sense is not common. All right, so basically you need to assess various practices or various situations, hazardous situations in the industry. It could be unsafe practices, it could be unsafe conditions, and it could be due to other things like the faults in the system, in the processes, and other things like that. So from here, you could see basically you could try to identify some of the risks you could see here. This guy, for example, is quite unstable the way he's standing on this ladder, if it's a ladder, and then he's not maintaining 3 points of contact, which is required for ladders. Okay, so issues like that. And you could see here unsafe practices, or here they are trying to lift an object, but they're not doing it in the proper way. And here you can see this guy is sitting on the scaffold, right, on the railings of the scaffold, right, which is not meant for that, without having any harnesses, right, to tie or to be anchored to a fixed point on the scaffold. As well as this other guy here is like they're standing there and they're discussing, right, which is not, that's not what the scaffold is meant for. It's meant for them to do the tasks that they are supposed to do while taking safe measures, and then to come down once they are done with this task. You could see here as well, maybe exaggerated, but here just to give you a perception of what the idea behind risk assessment. This is a flammable or explosive material close to a heat source from what this guy is doing. Right here, you can see this guy working on a huge machine without having proper support or proper anchoring of this machine so it could work there. And this is an unsafe act. Is what they're supposed to find a better way, a better procedure to carry out the maintenance or repair process. You could see other examples here. Now, let's talk about why do we carry out risk assessment? Okay, what's the benefit? What's the essence of carrying out risk assessment? So one of them is to determine the measures required by the organization to comply with relevant health and safety legislation. So the first thing is compliance. Okay, so risk assessment helps in complying with necessary or relevant legislations or laws. These are legislations or laws set by the state or the country in where this work is being carried out, or by the organization, or let's say the association where the organization belongs. It could be construction organizations, oil and gas organizations, or to the standards set by the organization itself. Okay, they might have their own standards which they expect to comply with, or to meet to meet up to, and so they have to carry a risk assessment to measure their level of performance. So this is compliance. Now, risk assessment does more than that. It can also be considered as a proactive strategy to reduce injuries, occupational injuries, ill health, and fatalities, as well as other issues like losses. Okay, losses when you have damages to equipment or to your facility or your property, as well as damage to the environment, which is a very big issue today. Okay, so it could also help in these areas as well. So now risk assessment could also help you to reduce direct and indirect costs to an organization. So direct costs could include insurance, okay, insured costs, sorry. This is claims on employers, public liability insurance, damage to buildings, equipment, or vehicles. All these are insured. They are direct costs. Direct costs means that you can easily measure them, all right? You can determine its worth, its value, all right? So some of them could be insured in terms of the fact that you pay insurance for this, and some could be uninsured cost. Insured in this is the value to the bottom line, or the point here is that you could claim this from the insurance company, all right? And in this case, you are transferring the risk. It means here the risk could be transferred to the insurance company once it is insured, all right? As for the other one, which are uninsured, like fines from the government, sick pay, okay, damage to products, that's what you produce, equipment or process. Some of them may be uninsured. In this case, you have to cover the costs yourself. The other could be indirect costs. Okay, indirect costs because they are not directly measured. You may find a way to measure them, but they are not exactly. You cannot exactly determine how much you lose from this. Some of them could be insured, like business loss, how much losses you've made in the business, product or process liability. Some of them could be insured, like loss of goodwill. That is when you start becoming unpopular with the people, extra overtime payments, accident investigation time, production delays, and all this could be indirect costs. So in carrying out risk assessment, you could follow this framework, which is the risk management framework from ISO. All right, risk assessment is just the one here in the middle, which has risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. All right, the entire framework is called risk management. All right, so you can see it has other issues like monitor and review, communication and consultation and with various stakeholders, establishing the context, that's the scope, right, the reason, in general the context of the risk assessment, treating the risk, seeking ways to carry out for risk treatment. So the whole thing is called risk management. But risk assessment itself follows these three main processes. The first is called risk identification or riskid. Okay, you can say riskid as well, which is basically risk identification, identifying the risk. Okay, or you could call it hazard as well. Okay, identifying the hazards. Okay, or hazard identification. And the other one is risk analysis. Okay, and lastly, risk evaluation. Here as well, for those that are going to take the NEBOSH IGC, they have this process as well, where description of the organization and methodology used. Okay, basically when they want to write their reports on the NEBOSH, they have to provide this various flow of information. The other one is called risk assessment, which is what we described now, the process and risk assessment. Then they have to choose 3 actions. Okay, priorities. Yeah, the three top risks. Okay, they have to prioritize them with justification, and then they have review, communicate, and check. So they have to follow this process. Okay, here also risk assessment could also be in 5-step process. Okay, it's very popular in the UK that they have this 5-step process for risk assessment, where the first one is called identify hazard, which is hazard, which we mentioned in the previous slide. Decide who might be harmed and how, that's the people that may be affected. Then we have risk, evaluate the risk and decide on precautions. Okay, here you're going to have the risk analysis and risk evaluation. All right, and then here recording your findings and implementing them, reviewing your assessment and update them if necessary. That means that you review them when there are any changes in the organization or new risks are identified, or when there are any reasons for you to believe that the risk assessment that was made previously is inadequate or is insufficient. Also here you can see these are the templates for risk assessments provided by the NEBOSH, where you have hazard category and hazards. So here we have one hazard category which is working at height, all right, and then the hazard is described here as people or items falling. You have who might be harmed by the hazard is mentioned here. What are you already doing? Yeah, this is the existing controls. Okay, call this existing controls. Okay, and then here you have further controls that could be made to reduce the risks further. All right, because after you determine your existing controls, you come up with what you call the residual risk. Okay, residual risk means that the risk that is still present despite the existing controls. All right, so we call those residual risks, and then after that you determine what further controls can be put in place or recommendations, and then of course after that you're going to come up with what's the future risk level. In this future risk level, you're going to determine if it is acceptable by your organization, that is the risk owner, the decision maker. Because the future risk, will have to determine if this is acceptable, and if that is, then what are the time scales in this which these recommendations are going to be implemented. Okay, I'm going to talk a little briefly about these recommendations in the next slides. All right, these time scales in which they're going to be implemented and who's responsible for this. And this allows you to do what? This allows you to follow up. Okay, you create a schedule. Okay, you create a schedule for the implementation of recommendations, and then you follow up on this recommendation. Here you could see also the risk assessment process could be broken down here into in more detail. One of them is firstly describe the activity or the task, the equipment, the process, the facility for which the risk assessment is to be carried out. Then next is what we call the hazard, and here this is called the context. Okay, This is called the context of the risk assessment. And here, this is the hazard identification, okay, or risk kit, hazard or risk kit. Then people who may be affected by the risk, okay. Assess the risk based on severity of the hazard, that is risk evaluation, okay, risk analysis and evaluation. And then here, describe the measures necessary to control the identified risk. This is based on HOCs. HOCs means the hierarchy of controls, which I'm going to show you next, okay. And we have various forms of hierarchy of controls. I'm going to explain this next. Then you reassess the risk to determine, based on the planned recommended controls, to determine the residual risk. So based on these controls, existing controls, you assess the risk, and then you make additional controls to determine the future risk. Okay, then you document the details of persons carrying out the risk assessment and the time, and document to record risk assessment exercise. So this is basically just another flow of how to carry out the risk assessment process. So here you could see in determining the risk or in hazard identification, you could use these various categories, okay, for hazard. So you want to determine hazards on your site, you could determine the hazards based on materials available on site, or based on the environment, hazards that are related to the environment. There are checklists available for these. It could be provided by your company, or you might find this available in some standards or in some references. You might find checklists, okay, to identify specific hazards under each of these categories. Okay, so you could have materials, you could have environment, you could have equipment, people, or hazards related to the system. Or you could have this other category. You could say, for example, crane accidents. What kind of hazards or causes, what may lead to crane accidents? So you identify these as hazards. Slips, trips, and falls, power, electrical heat, chemical bonds. You have power tool accidents, falls from height, falling objects, fire outbreak and explosions, struck by fixed or moving objects, exposure to toxic hazardous materials, scaffold accidents, structural collapse, asphyxiation, respiratory issues, trench and excavation accidents, and drowning. So you could identify potential causes of all these accidents and present them as hazards. This is another one which is gotten from the NEBOSH IGC 2 framework. So you can see we have here noise, vibration, radiation. You could have work related. This is ergonomic hazards, has to do with people and their muscles and stuff like that. You have hazardous substances or hazmat, hazardous materials. You could have health, welfare, and work environment, which is physical hazard, work at height, confined spaces, and stuff like that. You could have work equipment and machinery. You could have fire or explosion. You could have electricity. So hazards could also be identified in these categories as well. So then let's talk about the risk matrix. Now the risk matrix, you could have here what you call consequences, all right, and you could have likelihood here, this, and you have the consequences here. And like I said, this is basically qualitative risk assessment matrix. All right, this is qualitative, where you simply determine the level, the likelihood of those hazards that you've identified previously, and the consequences of those hazards based on your engineering judgments, based on your professional judgment. You determine if it is very likely or it is highly unlikely. And this could also be based on consensus by your risk assessment team. If you have a team, it could be based on consensus of various members of the team on how to classify or categorize the likelihood of a specific hazard to be very likely or be very unlikely. This will be from your experience, your judgment, okay, and then also the consequences, if it is negligible or it is fatal, right? So you could also determine this, and based on that you can come to the matrix and determine the risk. Let's say, for example, for an unlikely likelihood and the major injuries consequences, the risk is going to be medium. All right, so it's left to the decision maker or the risk owner to decide if this is acceptable, or if it's unacceptable, then he has to you have to implement controls to bring down the risk to, let's say, low. Okay. Now, in controlling the risk, we have a principle called the ALARP or ALARA. Okay, you call it ALARP or you call it ALARA, right? And that means that as low as reasonably applicable or reasonably practicable, all right, as you can see here, all right? For here, it is either practicable or you could say applicable or allowable, probably. Okay, and this has to do with what the specific risk, okay, and what is going to cost you to bring down the risk. You can see here in this inverted triangle, we have the high risk in this region, which is unacceptable region, and we have the low risk in this region, which is the green region, which is acceptable. And then we have here in the middle medium risk, which is a tolerable region. So basically, how do we decide that risk has been reduced to the ALARP region? We can only decide that once we see that the costs to bring down the risk any further is will exceed any perceived benefits. You see, it says here that risk tolerance if cost reduction will exceed the improvement gained. Okay, if the cost to bring down the risk further is not worth it, all right, then in this case we say that the risk is in this region, which is in the tolerable region. Otherwise, we all want the risk to be in the acceptable region, in the green region, but this is not always practical. It's not always applicable, all right, because it's going to cost a lot, or it's extremely expensive to bring the risk down to that level, all right, and then the gains the perceived gains are not really what the cost required to bring the risk that low. This is what you call hierarchy of controls, HOCs. Hierarchy of controls simply means that various strategies used in treating the risk or bringing down your risks levels. So you could have, for example, what you call elimination, all right, substitution, and you can see the definitions here. Elimination means you simply remove the hazards, okay? You eliminate the hazard by using a different approach. For example, using robotics, for example, or let's say you have to go to very hazardous locations to carry out inspection. So you could use a drone or you could use robots, for example, to eliminate the hazards. People don't have to go there. So there are various strategies. This depends on the hazard, okay? Depends on the hazard, and then you can find various strategies that you could apply to eliminate the hazard. This could come from research. This could come from previous experience. This could come from your colleagues that have dealt with similar hazards. This could come from standards and guidelines, trade organizations, or even it could be innovative as well. You could come up with new methods as well, okay? This could be innovative. So basically, you either go for best practices in the industry or you create innovative approaches. Similar with substitution, which means you replace the hazards, okay, with less hazardous materials and stuff like that. Engineering controls, you isolate the hazard using various engineering methods. This is what you call hazard controls, and the other one is called exposure controls, by promoting awareness through training. All right, you could train people, all right, or you could have also administration, okay, manage behaviors of people. PPE is the last level, right, in terms of effectiveness. As you can see, PPE here is the last level of control. So it's wrong for people to always assume that once you have a hazard on a site, that the next thing you need to do is use PPE. PPE is the last level. You need to use the higher levels of controls on the HOC. So this is another one. I prefer this because this firstly has an additional level on top called risk avoidance. Some people think that risk avoidance and elimination means the same thing, but risk avoidance could actually come from the design of the facility or the design of the workplace. You design the workplace in such a way that the risk is totally removed, right? And you don't even have to worry about it in operation, during the operation of the facility. So it's a good way to see how can risk be avoided, okay, and then otherwise how could it be eliminated, and then you come down like this on the hierarchy of controls up until you get to PPE. So that brings us to the end of this session. I have just some few review questions here to recap. So here, first question says a hazard is defined as potential to cause harm. Obviously, that is true. Okay, so risk is defined as the likelihood that harm will occur. The key word is likelihood. That is true. Okay, I said an objective of risk assessment is to comply with relevant health and safety legislation. That is also true. Compliance, this is one of the main basic ideas behind risk assessment, even though there are also other advantages of risk assessment or purposes of objectives of risk assessment. Now, risk avoidance is the first level in the ANSI Z590.3 HOCs. Z590.3 ANSI means basically prevention through design standard by ANSI. Okay, it's called the PTD standard, and basically it's about eliminating or removing hazards in the design of workplaces, facilities, from the design stage. They call this risk avoidance, and this is true. Okay, PPEs is the last line of defense in risk control. Is the last line of defense in risk control. That is also true. Okay, PPE is not the first line, it's the last line of defense, and we should seek to use higher levels of controls in the HOCs. We should use higher level of controls in the HOCs before we come down to PPE. So this brings us to the end of our session, and hopefully we're going to continue with more detailed explanations in risk assessment, the various strategies that are used in risk assessment. Maybe also we're going to review a case study, okay, in risk assessment. So thank you for listening, and hope to see you guys in the next presentation. Thank you. Bye.